Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to episode 2 of Natural Horror November, where I'm hijacking Anatomy of Fear for a month and doing a total deep dive into my favorite genre. Today I'm going to be looking at the first category of natural horror, and the challenge here is that it's by far the broadest category. It's what I call true natural horror. Now, I promise you I'm not giving it that name to be pretentious or anything. What I choose to call true natural horror is simply films that seem to depict the same world we literally live in. There's no speculation, no new information that we've never currently been privy to, and no real suspension of disbelief is required. The truest of natural horror films is terrifying precisely because it requires very little imagination. We're typically told that horror films are made or broken on the filmmaker's ability to make us fill in the scary gaps of the unknown with our own imagination. That is the conventional wisdom. But it's true that if the thing in question is unknown, then exploiting our fear of it is best suited to the horror genre. But some of our greatest fears are not the unknown at all, it's the known, but simply the forgotten. One of my favorite aspects of natural horror is that it's almost alone in the horror genre in its aim to exploit our known fears rather than the unknown ones. I mean, there are slashers too, which exploit our known fears of actual serial killers, and I'm sure there are other examples too, but natural horror is my favorite. Perhaps it's because I spent so much time alone as a kid purposely getting lost in the wilderness around my childhood home of Harrison, New York. One of my most disturbing memories as a child occurred when my friends and I had come home late one night after playing manhunt in the woods. This was after spending the whole day riding our bikes all around and climbing through trees and whatnot. Well, it wasn't the poison ivy that got me that day. I had gotten into a nice hot shower, and as I reached to pick up the bar of soap, I noticed what looked like a piece of dark wood under my fingernail. I picked at it with my fingers, but it didn't work, so I tried grabbing it with my teeth. This worked, but it didn't feel like the chip of wood was in my mouth, so I looked around the tub to see if it had fallen out. Then I felt something move inside my mouth, and my eyes went wide. I quickly spit it out, whatever it was, and it landed on the side of the tub. At first it didn't move. It was small and round, and I thought I'd imagined it at first. But then, like some creepy mechanical creature out of a nightmare, it spread its 6 legs out all at the same time and just started walking away as if nothing had happened. It was a tick, and I've never felt good about ticks since. Even though the Seth Green film featuring the same mutated creature is quite silly, as a child it was beyond terrifying to me. I would have probably found it scary as an adult too, because my lack of any need to imagine ticks as something terrifying would have done all the work. But whether or not we personally have a story like this about one creepy crawly thing or another, we've all seen or heard stories. Perhaps there's some degree of imagination required, in the sense that vicariously lived experiences are no substitute for real ones. But come on, if you find out there's a lion loose in your neighborhood, do you really need that much imagination to be freaked out? I'll even take it a step further. Have you ever wondered why our scariest movie monsters all seem to bear a likeness to some other non-human creature? From werewolves to xenomorphs and everything in between, the scariest ones all have similarities to animals and insects that already frighten us. I believe that this is because of our evolutionary biology. Our ancestors committed their biggest traumas and greatest threats to detailed memory. Their fears were everyday realities, and they imprinted onto our genes. But that's a topic for another day. To me, natural horror is different from other horror in the same way that your fear of some shapeless object seen through a waterlogged window or some broken eyeglasses produces a fundamentally different kind of fear, because you don't know what you're looking at. You don't know if it's threatening, as opposed to seeing clearly through that same window an animal that clearly wants to eat you. So true natural horror is a great place to start because it is the simplest yet most wide-reaching and diverse. In fact, it's so wide-ranging that this episode's intended not as an exhaustive encyclopedic run-through of true natural horror films, because that would likely take hours. Indeed, that's the whole reason for me starting this podcast. There's so much to talk about in this genre that I could do several episodes just talking about these films. Disaster horror and isolation horror are both offshoots of this category of true natural horror films, and they'll be given their own episodes. As for the rest, I'm going to resist the urge to merely name them and talk about them. Instead, I want you to come away from this with a pretty good idea of what this type of horror film is actually like. In this episode, I'm going to talk about two major threads of true natural horror, both originating from two classic horror films. Then I'll give a few more examples of the genre that I think are noteworthy. It's very likely that there are films that you're wondering why I haven't mentioned. It could just be for time, or it could be that I'm going to talk about them in a later episode. As Shakespeare once said, brevity is the soul of wit, and I'm going to try and stick to that. I won't spend too much time talking about general animal attack movies because everyone kind of gets it. You got a big thing, and it wants to eat you. Much of the time, there's nothing more to it than that. But if nothing else, it is worth noting how relevant this type of story is to our daily lives. I mean, many of these movies are literally ripped from the headlines. If you've ever seen 2003's Open Water, for example, about some scuba divers that are left behind in shark-infested waters, that was based on a true story. American tourists Tom and Eileen Lonergan were actually left behind by a diving company in the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Queensland, Australia. And when they realized the mistake 2 days later, it was too late. Now, their life jackets were later found undamaged, so it's likely that it wasn't actually a shark, but the premise of being left behind is scary nonetheless. Then there was 2007's Black Water, about a saltwater crocodile attack that took place in a swamp of northern Australia. Backcountry was based on a real-life bear attack that took place in Canada. And then there's 2007's Prey, about some dam builders in Africa that are attacked by a pair of lions. This one is very interesting. This is based on two specific lions that back in 1898 attacked railway workers for months, picking them off in the middle of the night and dragging them from their tents. The two maneless lions were actually given the name Savo man-eaters, and word quickly spread of their bizarrely ferocious attacks. The one that has me raising my eyebrows, though, is the whales. With everything else going on in the world, you may have missed it, but whales right now are kind of pissed. Every day now, it seems like there's news stories that I keep hearing about orcas attacking sailboats, like the ones in the Straits of Gibraltar. A recently published study off the coast of San Francisco found that great white sharks there are actually terrified of the orcas, and they swim away as fast as they can whenever they come nearby. And I can see why. There's another article from the New York Post titled, "Orcas are ripping open great white sharks for their livers, hearts, and testicles." Yikes. There's an actual movie called Orca in which some marine hunters kill an orca's pregnant mate and spends the next 2 hours getting revenge. So it turns out this kind of story is not fiction anymore if it ever was. And let's not forget, there are plenty of things that already exist in the natural world that if you were to see it in a movie without explanation, you probably wouldn't even believe it. We have walking catfish, which are an invasive species. We have wolverine frogs, which are hairy frogs that have actual claws. And God knows what undiscovered creatures still lurk at the bottom of the ocean, down where entire ecosystems have only recently been discovered. If you'd be freaked out to find a shark in a water hazard on a golf course, well, that's happened as well. They have no idea where it came from, but yeah, one day there were sharks in the water. Oh, and then there's murder hornets. They made a brief appearance earlier this year, and who knows if they'll come back. The year's not over yet. These gigantic wasps are the stuff of nightmares, and most of us pampered Americans had no clue such things exist in our world. And the thought that, as an invasive species themselves, they might have the potential to completely wreck our ecosystems and throw our agriculture sector into complete disarray, that is a horror movie premise in the making. And it would be a thrilling spectacle if it weren't so frighteningly possible. But enough about the real-life events that lead to movies. There are plenty, but the number of events upon which a person could base a movie are just as countless. Just look at what has been going on in the world right now, and no, I'm not talking about politics. We are in the middle of a pandemic, and of course everyone is concerned about that. We did a whole episode about pandemics and horror, which you should definitely check out, by the way. Pandemics are also a type of disaster, and so I'll talk about them in my episode on disaster horror. Actually, though, I'm talking about the many animal attacks that have been happening. When news sites want to get clicks, they can easily get them by reporting on common disasters like earthquakes and big storms, especially tornadoes and hurricanes. But when we hear about animal attacks, we generally regard them as isolated events, and usually they are. But this may be less and less true as the days go on. An article from The Guardian titled "Urban Beasts: How Wild Animals Have Moved into Cities" makes some claims that ought to make your hair stand on end. The list of animals that have currently taken up residence in major cities include wolves in Germany, falcons in New York and London, wild boar in Rome, leopards in Mumbai, hyenas in the Ethiopian city of Harar, and of course, mountain lions in LA. I've already talked about the dog problem in Moscow in my Russian horror video, and that's a very interesting case too. Moscow has 35,000 stray dogs, and about 20% of them apparently know how to ride this subway to get where they want to go. I wish I was making that up. In fact, it's so well known that dog experts from all around the world have gone to Moscow to study how dog behaviors evolve based on their surroundings. They classify them as domesticated, semi-feral, and feral. Those differences are important. Actual wolves, as the Guardian article also points out, are incredibly opportunistic. They can hunt as a pack, but they're not above coming into the cities to get what they can get. And this is a story that is repeating itself all over the world. It could be that man is expanding his footprint into nature, which would certainly be in line with the revenge themes of natural horror, particularly in the 70s. Or it could just be that animals know that it's easier to get food in the cities. And that's because it kind of is. Humans have a lot of food, and we also waste a lot of food. If wild animals are learning that eating from the trough of our dumpsters is a heck of a lot easier than hunting, well, that's because it is. I mean, it's literally what humans did thousands of years ago, when we decided that raising livestock was easier than hunting. An idea that makes so much sense, by the way, that it had to have been a woman that came up with it. If you ask me, I don't think this is man getting his comeuppance, as might easily be concluded by anyone that is shocked and appalled to find a lion in his backyard. Nevertheless, revenge is a very powerful emotion, and it runs through many of our natural horror films, and the true natural horror films in particular. So if most of the natural horror films of the 70s involved revenge as a theme, I think it's just that. It's not a feature of natural horror any more than Transylvania is a feature of vampire films. It merely reflects a time and place of a certain type of film. Revenge was very popular in the 70s. Action films featured a very hardened, Dirty Harry, rape revenge was a popular genre, and even the religious horror films suggested that on some level, man has kind of had it coming for a long time. The entire country was reeling from the rampant corruption in government, and the love revolution had turned quite violent. There was simply not enough drugs and sex to pacify a nation that was quite frankly pissed. And so, is it any surprise that the first film to be called an actual blockbuster, a film that captured the feeling of the entire era, was a film about a shark attacking a tourist town?
There is a creature alive today who has survived millions of years of evolution without change, without passion, and without logic. It lives to kill. A mindless eating machine. It will attack and devour anything. It is as if God created the devil and gave him jaws.
I don't think enough credit is given to the marketing Jaws received, which contributed to its success, but the reasons for its staying power are pretty obvious. The shark in Jaws is not just a shark. It's a metaphor for the indifference of change. Nobody in the movie wants to change a single thing, even though at least some are aware that there's something terribly wrong about all this. In fact, the entire arc of the main character concerns his inability to take action. His masculinity has been dissected by countless scholars who have viewed his story through the lens of sexual impotence. Other characters, too, have moments where this symbolism seems to suggest meaning, such as when Hooper drops his spear, while being attacked in the shark cage. Now, I'm not the person that's going to go through each of these films to point out every phallus. I'll leave that to the quote-unquote experts. Truthfully, there's a lot of ways you can interpret a film like Jaws, and that has as much to do with why it's a classic as anything else. Mostly, I think it just comes down to it being a good film. It has good pacing, great kills, good dialogue, great characters, and very memorable moments. It's not bloated with unnecessary action beats. It doesn't get overly complicated politically or dramatically. The only things that made it into the film are the things that needed to be in there. And of course, I credit Spielberg's expert cinematography and directing to much of its success as well. Here's the thing, though. Jaws was not following in the traditions of natural horror up to that point, yet it more or less set up the template that we still kind of use today. So while Jaws really is the masterpiece it seems to be, it became, for better or worse, the standard by which all natural horror films were judged. I'm sure Spielberg was simply following the book, which was mostly an anti-war treatise, wherein the young children that were victims of the shark were meant to serve as analogous to the young people being sent overseas to fight and die in an impossible-to-win war. Quint's story towards the end of the movie about how his battalion was dropped into shark-infested waters basically spells this out clearly. Peter Benchley's book was meant to be interpreted as an anti-war protest story. Spielberg kept the second half largely intact, minus a few obviously big changes, and he structured the first half more like a slasher. Spielberg also changed a few characters to be more sympathetic. In the movie, the mayor is merely looking out for the best interest of the town, but in the book is under the thumb of the mob who threatens to break his kneecaps if he even thinks about closing the beaches. The theme of a man speaking an uncomfortable truth in a community that doesn't want to hear it, which is very much evident in Benchley's book as well, likely came from a Norwegian play called An Enemy of the People, in which a man speaks out about bacteria found to be present in the baths of a newly opened spa. Indeed, this whistleblower idea is very old, but in 1975, I'm sure you can see why whistleblowers were very significant. But whistleblowers weren't really a thing in natural horror before this, and this is precisely why I think Jaws stands out among other nature attack stories. It just doesn't follow the trends that existed in the genre, and it's easy to miss that. One example is in how the hero is portrayed. Usually, the hero is a male, but is an arrogant but likable guy. Captain Kirk would be more at home in the natural horror genre than wimpy, emasculated Brody. Actually, a good example is William Shatner himself as the charming sheriff that has to figure out how to stop the growing threat of tarantulas in Kingdom of the Spiders. Prior to Jaws, there were other key examples. In 1972, Frogs showed a very young, fit, and handsome Sam Elliott being a man of few words and who carefully puts the pieces together about the suspiciously indifferent wealthy family he spends the weekend with. Before this, in nearly every large creature feature of the Godzilla era, the main character would be a handsome young man that is simply wanting to get to the bottom of whatever it is. He usually lacks knowledge of the creature, but he has good instincts and he has connections. The person that's called in as the expert is also very different in Jaws. In the days of the big monster movies, the expert was usually a man, because of course it was. But even then, he usually had a female assistant, such as in Them, Tarantula, and of course the co-ed marine biologist team from It Came From Beneath the Sea. William Shatner's expert in Kingdom of the Spiders was a female veterinarian. Also female was the bacteriologist in Food of the Gods, who is constantly having to fend off chauvinistic insults from her boss the whole movie. And there's the health department inspector in the rat infestation movie Deadly Eyes, as well as the reptiles expert in Alligator, who went from being a little girl that flushes a baby alligator down the toilet to eventually investigating that same alligator. In fact, the dynamic between the lone male hero and the intellectual female expert is actually kind of an important one. So I'm going to read an excerpt from a great book called Massacred by Nature by Lee Gambin. I highly recommend this book if you really want to learn more about the behind the scenes and all the different facts behind a lot of these natural horror films that we're going to be talking about. It's a great book to get that encyclopedic knowledge from somebody who clearly loves the genre. So this is what he writes about the lone male hero. He says, A common thread in a lot of these movies, especially those made in the subgenre's most thriving period, the 1970s, involved the male lead as a haunted loner with some kind of vice that keeps him weak and ineffectual, alcoholism being a very popular hindrance. But by about the 20-minute mark, he's forced to man up as soon as he's introduced to the female lead, usually a strong, intelligent, and also beautiful professional of some kind. She's usually somebody that has earned her stripes and worked hard, usually coming from a working class background. She has not only had to fight all her life as someone on the low end of the socioeconomic ladder, but she is also someone who has had to constantly fight sexism in her chosen field. The attraction between the haunted male loner and the sassy, smart specialist is either instant or gradual, although sometimes, but rarely, non-existent. At first, the male protagonist is simply interested in the female counterpart's physical beauty, but soon enough he sees a fighter in her that he respects. As depicted in most of these movies, these strong-willed women are also great questioners of authority, political and social institutions of all types. The male lead admires this kind of inquisitiveness and determination, and eventually he comes to assist her in whatever the plight may be. The rogue male's appeal for the woman comes from the core of his inner strength and genuine but deeply hidden compassion that will eventually triumph by the end of the last reel. What usually grounds the loners is their ability to love, even though this compassion hides behind a gruff and stoic exterior. Elsewhere, Gambin also suggests that there might be something relating a woman to nature that makes her uniquely qualified to speak to her mysterious behaviors. There might be something to that. However, aside from Sheriff Brody's drinking problems, there is none of this in Jaws. At best, there is the theme of brotherhood, but it doesn't help to solve the problem of the shark. It merely, if anything, helps them cope with the result. That's not to say anything other than Jaws lies outside a mold found in other natural horror films of the era. The basic structure of a creature attacking a place and the town's leaders turning a blind eye is very much a motif started by Jaws. Not much has changed about this basic structure, by the way, although there are signs that this might change. Just this year, we got a great Dutch horror film that I mentioned in the last episode about a lion that is loose on the streets of Amsterdam. Despite the CGI animal, it's a wildly entertaining film with plenty of blood and guts and fun moments. But my favorite is when it pokes fun at the question of whether they should tell everyone about the lion, or try and catch it quietly so as not to start a panic. The police chief doesn't want to, but of course the zookeeper does. So this time, the police chief tells everyone, and hilariously no one believes him. And they accuse him of wanting to start a panic. There's even a subtle reference to Jaws with a joke about a shark being seen in a canal. And after the press conference, the police chief says, "See, that's what you get for being open and honest." The film has a lot of good satire on the genre, and shows that animal attack movies can be a great vehicle for satire as well. This is the exception to the rule, though. As we go through this genre, I hope you'll keep in mind just how different your expectations have to be for what it actually is. The concept of woman's intimate connection with nature goes back more than a decade to that famous feathered thriller starring Tippi Hedren in one of Hitchcock's best remembered films.
That's the damnedest thing I ever saw.
Birds just don't go around attacking people without no reason.
Yes, they attack the children. Attack them.
What's the matter with all the birds? Birds are not aggressive creatures, miss. They bring beauty into the world.
Those gulls attack.
Impossible.
They came in right down the chimney.
Why are they doing things?
It's the end of the world.
Are the birds gonna eat us, Mommy?
Get yourselves guns and wipe them off the face of the earth.
That would hardly be possible.
Mitch, don't!
The 5 continents of the world contain more than 100 billion birds.
All at once, the birds were everywhere.
Why don't you all go home? Lock your doors and windows.
Did you get the windows in the attic? When do you think they'll come?
What happens when you run out of wood?
I don't know.
You don't know. When will you know? When we're all dead.
While big creature features were still in fashion, The Birds was probably the first true natural horror film. I mean, if you want to go all the way back, there was a silent film called A Terrible Night that you could totally watch on YouTube, and it's about, well, I won't spoil it for you. But if you don't count that movie, I prefer to start with The Birds as a starting point. Hitchcock's already given credit for having possibly kickstarted the slasher genre with Psycho, and so it seems almost greedy to credit him with kickstarting natural horror as well. but it really was a first in a lot of ways. Animals in film up to that point were usually one of a few things. They were either secondary characters, or they were purely fantastic creatures and totally imaginary. Or they were mutations brought on by nuclear testing. More on that in the next episode, though. But the birds was probably the first to not only give them top billing, but do so without changing the creature at all. These birds are not the size of houses, and they're not imaginary. They're simply birds. It's not like you can even say the sheer number of them that you see in the film is all that out of the ordinary either. Anyone that follows me on Instagram probably knows that about 2 years ago, I posted a video from when I was in Houston on work, and the video featured not hundreds, but thousands of blackbirds all over the buildings, bridges, signs, and power lines. It was so chilling that I posted the video in black and white for the added effect of the terrifying movie it reminded me of. I was told by the locals that it's quite common and happens every year. Thousands of these birds are seen in parking lots all over Texas. They're called grackles, or devil birds to use another term. Personally, I think all birds that are not ducks are of the devil. But that's just me. The point is, if you don't think a story like the birds is possible, think again. The only thing different about the birds is the change in their behavior. Birds just don't tend to act like they do in that movie, but there's no putting it past them. Animals have been known to change their behavior for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes they're stimulated, such as the countless stories we've all read about where birds are triggered to take flight during night in response to fireworks. Sometimes it's neurological, such as something called ataxia, which produces a loss of coordination. There may also be yet unknown causes behind sudden changes in behavior. One such film that did this was The Day of the Animals, another film featuring all live animals and some of the most beautiful photography of wild animals ever captured on film. The explanation for why these animals became aggressive, though, is a deteriorating ozone layer. Admittedly, that one seems a bit far-fetched. Interestingly, the birds doesn't seem the least bit interested in explaining the odd behavior of the birds. This is one of the aspects of the movie that is something of a first. If Americans have a desire for anything, it's a happy ending where everything makes sense. And even Hitchcock was kind of known for delivering that. In a sense, The Birds does have a happy ending, but only from a certain point of view. But this is not true literally, only dramatically. As many scholars have looked at the film, it's unmistakable that from a lyrical point of view, the birds didn't start acting up until Tippi Hedren's character showed up. She's an outsider, and her presence is very unwelcome. Every time she tries to assert her power, especially romantically, something bad happens. If later films rewarded women for empowering themselves, The Birds is a horror film that most definitely does not. The final scene of The Birds seems crystal clear thematically, and it's pretty chilling. The birds represent the various social pressures placed on women, most especially those of other women. For instance, it's a woman that tells Hedren's character that birds of different species never flock together, and it's a woman that accuses her of being the cause of the whole thing. And of course, her love interest has a mother that wants nothing to do with her either. It's a film that is a bit cruel to women, as most of Hitchcock's films were, to be honest, and his seeming disinterest in explaining the behavior of the birds only amplifies the sexual themes. The movie was based on a real incident of birds attacking and slamming into things in a harbor years ago, and it turned out then that in that case, the birds had been eating a toxic algae that made them act that way. Why exactly the birds in the movie are acting the way that they're acting is anyone's guess, but I will say, birds are friggin' weird, okay? I mean, even some normal bird behavior is pretty messed up, like the cuckoo, which invades a nest and kicks out all the other birdlings, or the loggerhead shrike, which is also known as the butcher bird because it's known for literally impaling its prey on thorns and barbed wire. I'm telling you guys, birds are not nice. Do not be friends with them. They are not your friends. In any case, the birds presented nature not so much as a literal on-the-surface threat, but as a metaphor for dramatic change. There is a lesson that Hedren's character is supposed to learn, and if you read between the lines, it's not necessarily a good lesson. She learns that her place is with a man. It's why the lovebirds are the only ones that don't attack anyone. And you might be tempted to say that Hitchcock intended this to be read ironically, but I doubt it. At best, it's open to interpretation. Is it a happy ending or not? Who knows? As with many classic films, The Birds was a big influence on many films. But the thread I would draw attention to are those that specifically avoid presenting nature as merely taking its revenge on humans. The Birds has a poetic style, and as with all visually poetic films, the literal explanation for events is the least important part of the story. These stories present nature as being out of balance, and the balance can only be restored if the right moral lessons are learned on the part of the characters. The telltale sign of these cautionary-type stories is the lack of an explanation for the attacks. There's a film that serves as a sort of bridge between the poetic nature of The Birds and the nature run-amok stories of the 70s, and that's Frogs.
Suppose nature gave a war, and everybody came. The snakes, the birds, the lizards and frogs. And suppose that the polluters, the species on Earth called man, were the enemy in that war.
I still believe man is master of the world.
And then, suppose that the human race lost.
Frogs is coming.
Frogs came out in 1972, and it's a very strange film, to say the least. Only someone that understands its context in the greater genre of natural horror could even begin to wrap their head around this very peculiar film. First off, I'm not going to tell you that it's good. I'll leave that for you to decide. At the very least, I can say it's one of the most unique films you'll ever see, because it represents the earliest form of eco-horror. Second, you should probably know about the frogs. I don't know how to say this, but there are no frogs in the movie. I'm just letting you know that right now. I'm sure that will come as much less of a shock to you, though, than it did to audiences that saw a poster with a giant frog with a human arm sticking out of it, giving any rational person the impression that this would be a movie about giant frogs that eat people. But this would be like marketing a Robert Altman movie as if it were by John Waters. People are just going to be disappointed. In reality, there's several creatures that attack in this movie, including snakes, birds, and when you finally do get to see the frogs, they turn out to not be actual frogs. They're actually toads. So if anyone ever asks you what movie had the absolute worst marketing, now you can tell them. It was Frogs. Anyways, Frogs is about a photographer that spends the day with a rich family that is celebrating the patriarch's birthday. The tycoon is believed to have polluted the area, and while that pollution is not shown to directly cause the behaviors of the vengeful wildlife, again, its poetic style suggests that this direct cause is not that important. The tycoon happens to be polluting the environment, but this film does such a good job at portraying him and his family as largely disconnected from the lower classes, as is evident by the disconnection with nature. This film's not interested in exploitation, which is why the marketing for it was so bizarre. It has more in common with the rules of the game than with Piranha. The rules of the game is that classic French film, also filmed in the style of poetic realism, and its most famous sequence features a group of game hunters firing on terrified rabbits in the middle of a field. Any film of the classical era that features wild animals interacting with the characters of the film in a poetic sense is in the same boat as this film. In terms of actual horror, I think horror fans may be a bit underwhelmed. The kills are not really that inventive, some of them are a bit ridiculous to be honest, and there's very little tension throughout. It's mostly just an odd film. Like, who was this film made for, is all I kept wondering. There's another film that attempts poetic realism in the same way, but does it much more successfully, and that's The Long Weekend.
Listen to the sound of evil. It is out there, waiting.
I'm sorry for this.
Powerful, deadly, invisible. They came to take a holiday. Now, they are running for their lives. Because something is out there.
The Long Weekend is an Australian film from 1978, and it's about a couple that goes on a camping trip. The husband means to use the camping trip to rekindle the deteriorating relationship, not knowing or caring that his wife clearly hates the outdoors. This film reminds me of Ernest Hemingway's story, Hills Like White Elephants. In that story, a couple waits for a train at a station in Spain and have a very long conversation, and it isn't until very late in the story that it becomes clear that what they're really talking about, or rather not talking about, is abortion. In a style so typical of Hemingway, which borders on the cryptic if you ask me, everything happens symbolically. You're a fly on the wall, and you're left to figure out what everything means. That's kind of how you have to watch The Long Weekend. We soon find out that the wife did in fact have an abortion, and the two do not seem to be on the same page about it. Never have I seen a movie where a husband and a wife fight the whole movie, and I'm actually kind of interested. Couples fighting in movies is never fun, but sometimes it's very rewarding. The role that nature plays in this film varies. Mostly, it's there to haunt the couple, maybe even punish them. When an eagle attacks the husband, it seems justified, but then the wife smashes the eagle's egg. And this happens before we even really know what's going on between them. Every incident with nature serves to move the story forward, and that's the true brilliance of the film. There's a creature called a dugong, which is basically like a manatee, that both the husband and wife regard as threatening in the beginning. He shoots it, even though it's far away and both of them are perfectly safe, and the wife looks pleased. Little do we know that this dugong is not dead and seems to keep coming back. At no point does this thing appear threatening, but the couple attempts several times to kill it. It becomes clear by the end of the movie that this seemingly non-threatening creature is a symbol for the life taken by the woman's abortion. All throughout, the husband treats nature quite disrespectfully, and the wife to a lesser extent as well. What stands out to me about this film is how menacing the nature feels. Even innocent and non-threatening things like a possum are given aggressive and non-friendly attributes. And at no point is it unclear that there's some moral failing to blame for this very hostile atmosphere. There are likely other films that utilize poetic realism to an extent, but hopefully that gives you a sense of some of the more creative approaches to natural horror. Often whenever natural horror is talked about at length, there is the tendency to group films by creature. That's what that book I quoted earlier did, Massacred by Nature. It's a very good book, and it looks at films by mammal, sea creature, insects, and so on. I can't pretend to do justice to this very wide genre with such groupings like that, and with such limited time. If these podcasts are well received, I would very much like to focus my attention on doing some of that in the future. But what I will do for the remainder of this episode is highlight what I feel are some of the more notable examples in each group, along with a few one-of-a-kind films. So let's start with dogs, because why not? I think natural horror films about dogs are unique in that nobody likes to see dogs go bad. They're man's best friend, and most of us have or have had dogs at one point in our lives. And the thought that they might turn on us just doesn't sit well with us. Cujo is the obvious standout here, and for good reason. Cujo's the story of a dog turning against man, but stripped to its bare minimum. It's not a dog that is loose and running around town and is kept secret by the town mayor and requires an expert to be called in to track it down. Cujo needs none of that extra. Cujo is just a mother, her boy, and a rabid dog foaming at the mouth. It's so simple, and that's why it works so well. I'm going to talk about Cujo in a later episode, though, so instead, I would draw your attention to a film that I think is every bit the masterpiece that Cujo is, and that's The Pack. And to be clear, this is the one from 1977. This is honestly one of the best animal attack movies ever made. because of the elegance of its premise. It's about an island where wealthy families vacation for the summer. When they come to the island, they get a dog, so the family has something to play with for the summer. But the kicker is, when they go home, they leave the dog behind. Over the years, so many dogs have been left behind that they've all formed a pack. The film picks up upon the departure of one such family, where one unlucky little dog is left tied to a tree. He eventually breaks free, and, soaking wet from the rain, eventually finds the pack, and it's clear that all these dogs are mean and nasty and angry, and they all have a right to be, and they expect this poor little pooch to be the same way. By the end, there's a really moving sequence where the dog clearly struggles with whether or not to trust humans again, or become one of the feral pack. This film does have quite a few scares, but it definitely tugs at your heartstrings. It finds a way to make each dog an actual character, with its own personality, and in the case of the main dog, an actual story arc. It's really pretty amazing. There are some good kills, and the dog acting, if you want to call it that, is pretty incredible too. I'll always go with a killer dog movie though, because you know what ranks number 4 as the deadliest animal according to CNET and Business Insider? Dogs. You know what's not even on the list? Sharks. Okay, how about sharks? Should I even talk about sharks? Do I need to talk about sharks? Yes, of course I do. Not because I want to, but because you want me to. See what you did, Jaws? See the countless movies made about your great white monster? Honestly, sharks are just greedy. I mean, I get it. Shark Week is a thing for a reason. Sharks are fascinating. Open water, the reef, the shallows, 47 meters down, deep blue sea, Sharknado. I mean, the list is endless. If someone comes out with another shark movie, everyone's going to go see it. Okay, I'm going to go see it too. Who am I kidding? Even to this very day, the one thing more than anything else that has the power to keep someone from going in the water is a shark. In all seriousness, though, the shark has become like a masked caper, fitting easily into a variety of different stories. It can be global in scope or very quiet and isolated. It also lends itself to jaw-dropping 3D, mostly due to the visual pleasure that comes from seeing sea creatures in their natural habitat. 47 meters down is a stellar example of introducing in stunning HD the terrifying landscape of the ocean floor for an entire movie. Something that will also never be unpopular is crocodiles and alligators. They are right up there with sharks in their popularity, and in case anybody's asking, I do have a spreadsheet to prove it. As you all probably already know if you've been listening to Anatomy of Fear, my favorite has got to be Crawl. It's a much more action-packed and visually stunning film than your average horror flick, and I only wish natural horror films were always given this level of talent and money to work with. I should probably mention spiders as another ever-popular creature. Spiders, like sharks, are far less deadly than we've been led to believe by movies. There are only a handful of species of spider on the planet that have venom strong enough to kill a person, and 99.999% of us will never likely come into contact with them. Statistically speaking, if you're in North America and you see a spider, it almost certainly is harmless. But they're scary! We only have 2 legs, but those unholy creatures have 8, and every species has a different number and layout of eyes, and those eyes are black. Who could love those things? Well, it turns out lots of people, which brings me back to a point I made in the last episode about the humane treatment of animals in films. Kingdom of the Spiders is a pretty remarkable film, especially since we got to see thousands of real-life tarantulas in broad daylight throughout the entire film, but there are a few moments where some of them are killed on screen. If this was a blight on the Spider-Verse of movies, you could say that it was course-corrected with the Spielberg-produced comedy Arachnophobia. There's a lot to say about this super entertaining movie, but I want to specifically give it props for how it found creative ways to use real spiders in ways that don't harm the spider. Some of the behind-the-scenes stories about how they trained the spiders to behave how they wanted them to is pretty amazing. There's something spectacular about seeing so many movies about real animals doing scary things, and to know that someone took the time to cast the real thing and was willing to add countless hours to the shooting schedule as a result. Working with real animals is not easy, and I give major props to anyone that does. That reminds me, I think we're nearing the end of this episode, but there's one more crazy movie I have to tell you about before I go. This movie is so bonkers, and it's one of those movies where the story of the making of the movie is crazier than the story itself. Years after starring in The Birds, Tippi Hedren and her boyfriend decided to make a little movie. The movie is called Roar, and it was a movie about a man that owns a bunch of lions and his family comes to visit while he happens to be out. I believe the film thinks it's a comedy, but it ends up being an unlikely horror movie, at least for part of the movie, and here's why. In the film's most terrifying sequence, the family members run from room to room to evade the many dozens of lions and tigers that are literally everywhere in this house. The whole time you're watching this movie, you're thinking, my God, how did they get that shot? Having actors interacting with so many lions and tigers had to be pretty nerve-wracking, but it all seems so real. How did they do it? Well, it turns out they just winged it. This film represents the most irresponsible filmmaking ever attempted, and it's kind of the reason why we now have laws about this sort of thing. So it all started when Tippi and her husband decided to make a movie about wild cats to raise awareness about them as an endangered species. Their plan was to raise a couple lion cubs in their house, not on their farm or in a wildlife reserve, in their house. Like a regular kind of house with a dishwasher and an ironing table. These bloodthirsty killing machines had dinner with them in the dining room on a regular basis, right along with their kids. Eventually, they moved the cats outside, but then they started getting more cats, and before they knew it, there were 150 of them on their property. All of them were untrained, but they made the film anyway. And as the tagline of the movie actually went, no animals were harmed during the making of this movie, but 70 casting crew members were. Because that's actually what happened. The stories are just nuts. John DeBont, who you may know as the director of Speed and Twister, he was the DP, and one day, his movements apparently startled one of the tigers, and he literally had his scalp ripped off. There's a picture of him on the internet somewhere with his scalp hanging down over his face, where he received 200 stitches. And he came back to work right after. Tippi also broke her leg riding an elephant, and Melanie Griffith, the poor girl, was also mauled by a tiger and needed reconstructive surgery on her face. Then there was also the matter of the whole sanctuary getting flooded during a rainstorm, and 15 lions escaped. And then there were wildfires, and it taking 3 years to make, only to bomb at the box office. I could go on. There are so many stories about this movie that will make your jaw drop. Normally, there are at least 4 trained professionals for every one cat. They only had like 1 or 2 part-time wranglers that weren't even trained themselves. So if this is one anxious movie to watch, that's because it totally was. Roar is, as some have called it, the most expensive home movie ever made. And there's no other movie like it. Nor should there be. And it really pushes the limit of what a natural horror film can be. Even though it probably wasn't intended to be a horror film at all. But believe me, there is a 10 or 15 minute sequence that is about as scary as any natural horror film I've ever seen. Well, on that delightful note, I think we've come to the end. Again, there are tons of movies that I didn't even mention, and that's not because they're not worth checking out or talking about, but I only have a short amount of time to convince you about the true greatness of this genre, and I really wanted to just give you something that you're not likely to get anywhere else. Hopefully I've done that with this episode. We have many more to go, and I hope you'll listen in next time. I'll be taking a look at the very tricky genre of mutation horror, and when it overlaps with natural horror and when it doesn't. Be sure to check out our blog, anatomyofear.com, if you want some movie recommendations for this month. If you watch any natural horror films of the month, be sure to tag it on social media with the hashtag NaturalHorrorNovember. If you have any comments, suggestions, or derogatory remarks, please don't hesitate to email anatomyofearpodcast@gmail.com and follow us on Facebook. I hope you all keep having a wonderful November, and I'll see you next time. Be safe.